Have you ever wondered what happens when someone with unlimited power completely loses control of their own body? Well, let me tell you about King Henry VIII of England. And trust me, this story is way more shocking than anything you learned in school. You probably know Henry as the king with 6 wives who started his own church. But here's what your history teacher never told you. By the end of his life, Henry had become something truly horrifying. We're talking about a man whose body was literally rotting while he was still walking around. His wounds smelled so terrible that servants would actually run away when they had to get close to him. Let me paint you a picture of what this king really looked like in his final years. Henry's belly had grown so enormous that it measured 54 inches around. That's bigger than most people are tall. He weighed about 400 pounds when most men back then weighed maybe 140. But the weight wasn't even the worst part. His legs were covered in these massive, festering sores that never, ever healed. Picture wounds that constantly oozed pus and rotting flesh. Gross, right? The smell was so intense that people in the royal court would hold perfumed handkerchiefs over their faces just to get near him. Some people said you could smell the king coming from several rooms away. Can you imagine having to work for someone like that? But wait, there's more to this medical nightmare. Henry had suffered a really bad head injury during a jousting accident in 1536. He was knocked unconscious for 2 whole hours, which back then basically meant people thought he was dead. Modern doctors think this brain injury completely changed his personality, turning him from a somewhat normal young king into the paranoid, rage-filled monster he became in his later years. The really sad part, Henry's own doctors were too scared to tell him he was seriously sick. Why? Because criticizing the king's health was considered treason, meaning you could be executed just for suggesting the king might need medical help. So this man, who claimed God gave him the right to rule, couldn't even get proper medical treatment because everyone was terrified of him. And here's something that would be funny if it was so tragic. In his final years, Henry couldn't even control when he went to the bathroom. Royal servants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went because he might have an accident at any moment. This is the same guy who was executing people for looking at him the wrong way. Now, you might think you know about Henry's 6 wives, but the reality of what those women went through was so much worse than just a simple execution. We're talking about psychological torture that would shock people even today. Take Anne Boleyn, for example. Henry didn't just decide to kill her one day. Oh no, he planned this elaborate setup where he forced people to lie about her under torture. But here's the really cruel part. He made Anne watch as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed for supposedly having affairs with her. She had to stand there knowing she was next, watching innocent people die because of her husband's crazy suspicions. Then there was Catherine Howard, who was basically still a teenager when Henry married her. When he found out about her past relationships before their marriage, he didn't just execute her. He actually changed the law to make it illegal for anyone to marry the king without revealing their entire romantic history first. Imagine being so petty that you changed the entire legal system because your teenage wife had dated people before meeting you. The psychological games Henry played were perhaps the worst part. He would shower his wives with expensive gifts and tell them how much he loved them one day, then completely ignore them or threaten them the next. It was like living with someone who could switch between being your best friend and your worst enemy without any warning. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, spent her final years basically as a prisoner in her own home. Henry wouldn't let her see their daughter marry and spread rumors that she was mentally ill. She died alone, possibly poisoned, writing letters to Henry that he never even bothered to read. And here's something that will blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign papers agreeing to their own divorces. Anne of Cleves was so terrified of him that she agreed to pretend their marriage had never happened, just to avoid being executed. She basically had to thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. Even Jane Seymour, who people call the lucky one because she died of natural causes, wasn't really that lucky. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son. And Henry was already looking for his next wife before Jane was even buried. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to to start planning his next marriage. 9 days, the man treated people like they were disposable toys. Now, let's talk about Henry's eating habits, because they were absolutely insane. If you think competitive eating contests are crazy today, you haven't heard anything yet. This man consumed roughly 5,000 calories every single day. That's more than double what a grown man should eat. And remember, Henry could barely walk by this point in his life. A typical meal for Henry included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several different types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to fill a bathtub. His kitchen staff had to prepare over 800 different dishes every day just for his household, with Henry personally trying dozens of them. They employed over 200 people working around the clock just to keep up with his appetite. But here's where it gets really weird. Henry believed certain foods had magical powers. He thought eating swan would make him more graceful, consuming lots of deer meat would make him a better hunter, and eating oysters would make him, well, let's just say he thought they'd help with his marriages. So he'd stuff himself with these specific foods in massive quantities, like some kind of medieval health fad gone completely wrong. Henry's meals were like theater performances. He would eat in front of hundreds of people, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Picture sitting there watching this enormous, smelly king slowly eat enough food to feed an entire village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal behavior. He was also incredibly paranoid about being poisoned. Every single piece of food had to be tasted by multiple servants first. But get this, he was so suspicious that he made his food tasters wait 30 minutes after eating before he detouched anything, just to make sure they didn't die from slow-acting poison. Speaking of paranoia, Henry's suspicious nature wasn't just about food. This man turned his entire kingdom into what we'd call a police state today. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he made life a living nightmare for everyone around him. He slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple knives under his pillow. But that wasn't enough. He also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Imagine being so scared that you couldn't even close your eyes without having people stare at you. The palace became like a fortress. Henry ordered secret passages built throughout every building he lived in, not for fun, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. He had peepholes put in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. Here's the really crazy part. Henry created a network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror show, where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you killed. Henry even suspected his own daughters of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own children, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were kids, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. His paranoia got so extreme that he started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He'd have someone killed because he had a bad dream about them, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only crime was being near Henry when he was in one of his paranoid moods. Now, you'd think Henry's reign of terror would end when he died, right? Wrong. This man was so committed to being a disaster that even his dead body managed to cause absolute chaos. In his final weeks, Henry was so massive that he couldn't walk at all. His servants had to carry him everywhere using a specially designed chair with wheels and pulleys. But here's the disgusting part. His infected leg wounds had gotten so bad that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as they moved him around. Servants had to follow behind him with cloths to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped on the palace floors. When Henry finally died, his body had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny. The smell was so overwhelming that even his doctors, who were used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room to throw up. Nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was dead. But the real chaos started during his funeral. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from decomposition that they had to reinforce his coffin and wrap his corpse in lead sheets, sealing it in multiple wooden boxes. They thought that would contain the mess. They were very, very wrong. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something absolutely incredible happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's decomposing body built up so much pressure that the lead lining burst open, and rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the funeral carriage. The smell was so horrible that the entire funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. And here is a detail that will probably stick with you forever. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed God gave him the right to rule ended up as dog food on a country highway. Even his burial was a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to fit the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support all that weight. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some said it was his ghost, but historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously rotting remains. Here is something really dark that you definitely do unlearn in school. Several of the servants who handled Henry's body died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from contact with his decomposing corpse. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII, not the charming king you see in movies, but a walking disaster whose own body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. A man so consumed by paranoia and gluttony that he turned one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his personal house of horrors. This guy became a prisoner of his own rotting body, and even death couldn't stop him from causing complete chaos. His legacy is unjust the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's a perfect example of how having unlimited power can turn a person into something genuinely monstrous. The most powerful man in England ended up being defeated by his own body, and his story shows us what happens when someone has so much power that nobody can tell them no, not even when they literally falling apart. If learning about the real Henry VIII has made you wonder what other shocking truths are hidden in history, stick around because there are plenty more disturbing facts that your textbooks conveniently left out. Trust me, this is just the beginning of how wild historical reality can get.